This is The Express with Gary Allen, your 360-degree view of the world. Now, here's your host, Gary Allen.
All right, and welcome everybody to The Express. Gary Allen with you here on this edition. Looking forward to tonight. We have a very wonderful guest coming on with us in just a little bit. Again, a reminder for you, you can keep in touch with me through Facebook at Gary Allen, A-L-A-N. You also go to youtube.com for some of my past shows, Gary Allen, The Express. And hey, come on, get in there and start listening to some of those old shows, or at least clicking on them anyway for me. Thursdays at 7 p.m., this program will repeat itself on diversitybroadcastnetwork.com, as well as progressivevoices.com on demand channel. I got some interesting news. Again, I will be sharing along with you. And the website is up and it is running as far as I know. It's still a little bit under construction. It's taken too long. You can go to Gary Allen Talk Show. .com. That's GaryAllenTalkShow.com, and you can check out the website and, let me know through Facebook what you think, et cetera, et cetera. Also, there'll be some other things coming up very, very soon, and I'm looking forward to that very much. And I know that my guest is currently on the line. David Teems, is with us. David was with us one other time, and with his great book on William Tyndale, the man who gave God an English voice. David is one of the finest writers in America today. He has written this wonderful, wonderful book called Majestie, The King Behind the King James Bible. So we're kind of moving a little back now instead of moving forward. To give you an idea about this book, it not only talks about the life and times of James as he grew up and at the age of 13 months became the king of Scotland, but he also spearheaded the most important literary undertaking in Western history, the translation of the Bible into a beautiful, lyrical, and accessible English. And we're going to get into his life and times. I think it's a lot of people, you've read the King James Bible, but you don't necessarily understand it from a standpoint of who was King James. I know for a long time I used to say as a little person, who's King James? Who's King James? And nobody could really tell me until this preacher did, about 10 years ago. So I wasn't asking everybody, but enough that I've become more interested. And this is a wonderful book. David, welcome to The Express, and thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. David, are you there? He's there because I see the phone number is there.
All right, what we'll do is if he hears us, we'll disconnect him. Don't try to call back. We'll call you right back.
Okay. All right, David. David, just hang on. We will call you back. This is an interesting story about a young man who I said at the age of 13 months old became the King of Scotland. He had an interesting lifestyle. We're going to get into that, and we're going to get into a lot of different things about King James. David, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can hear you now. I was just talking about James, and before we get into things, let's talk about the world of his at the time of his birth. I think that sets up what happened in his life, the mores and the realities of life for the royalty are a lot different than they are for you and I. But let's talk about the world he came into and how it shaped him to be the king that he was, not only of Scotland, but later in England when his mother was, shall we say, she lost her head over the whole situation. Yeah, a little. But I mean, becoming king at 13 months old is nothing unusual back in those days in Scotland. But tell us, before we get into James himself, what was the world like in Scotland and England when James came into the world?
Okay, James was born in 1566, a couple of years after Shakespeare. England was, well, let me go back to Scotland. He was born in Scotland, and Scotland was kind of like, you remember the movie Braveheart. Now, that was hundreds of years before that, but there was a lot of infighting and internecine kind of fighting going on and factions kind of ruling. And that's kind of the way Scotland was. Scotland was kind of a mess. And of course, having being crowned at 13 months old, he had to have people over him. and then there was a fight on that. James poor thing was he was kidnapped 9 times by the time he was a teenager, and basically one party would kidnap him and kind of rule kind of in his name, and then another would kidnap him. Poor guy. By the time he made it to the English throne in 1603, historians say he was the most neurotic king to ever sit on the English throne. But he fascinated me. I mean, this is England right before the golden age. England still has herself to prove. Elizabeth is Queen of England, and she was much stronger of the monarchs. Mary had a hard time. She had been Queen of France. For just a couple of years as a young girl. She hated Scotland, so she went back to a Scotland that she didn't love, and it was just one thing after the other. Mary, Queen of Scots, is one of my favorite characters, but boy, did she just fell into the wrong people. She was like a fawn among jackals.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the world he was born into. Just a lot of infighting, and he grew up. George Buchanan was his teacher, and George Buchanan had been Montaigne's teacher, the great essayist. But he was in his 60s. He was kind of a bully, kind of a guy. And but James was a very brilliant young man. I mean, here's a guy, even as a young boy, could speak Greek and Latin and French, and of course English, and could memorize whole swaths of scripture. And a matter of fact, Buchanan, his teacher, if a guest would come in, maybe a visiting ambassador or something, Buchanan would kind of show off and just have the guest pick a scripture at random, and have James read it or recite it, and he could do it in either French, English, or Latin, depending on which Bible he had, whatever the guest said. So he was brilliant, but he was tossed back and forth. Strangely enough, though, as he started ruling on his own by the time he was 17, and he became a pretty good, pretty savvy Scottish king. I mean, he learned by being in the midst of it all. He learned the street, so to speak, by being on the street, but that's the world he was grown into. James fascinated me because I was kind of a Shakespeare nut. I love that whole late Elizabethan age. The English language was at its peak. It'll never be that way again. And so I was fascinated with that. I've read everything I could on Elizabeth, even on her father and her mother, and just that whole 16th century. But over on the side was this character. He had kind of his legs, were really troubled. He had trouble walking, and he, some said his tongue was too big for his mouth, so his talking was kind of funny. But he started fascinating me, and it was James. And the more I got to read about James, the more I was smitten with the guy. I tell you, if you spend time with these people, even though it's 400 or 500 years ago, you can. The more you read of their own writing, particularly in original language, you can begin to get a feel for them, and this strange kind of empathy begins to happen. I remember standing outside my office one day, and I was crying, and Benita came up to me and says, "What in the world are you crying about?" And I said, this will sound so stupid, but I was crying about James, just the way he was treated as a boy. Here he was with a crown on his head, but nobody really saw the child beneath it. The crown was the issue. And so, he lost his mother at 11 months old, and his father was killed when he was 6 months old. And so, he was orphaned as soon as he came into the world. He never saw his mother again. She would give him toys and gifts, and his keepers would not allow him to have them.
Right.
It's really cruel. So I hope that answered your question, kind of set the scene up.
Oh, absolutely. And again, this book is really the predecessor to the Tyndale book, which we've already talked about on the program. And but I know you said you were fascinated by James, and of course, at the age of 13 months old, he became the King of Scotland, which, as you said in the book, is not necessarily uncommon for young children back then to be kings or queens in England and in Scotland.
Right. Yeah, his mother was. It happened the same way with her. she was just months old, and her father died, and so she became the Queen of Scotland. But then her and her mother, she went to France and married the young Dauphin. Of course, he died, I think, like at 15 or 17. He died, and she came back, like I said. So yeah, it was pretty common. The whole notion, one of the props that holds that whole age up is the divine right. I've been reading a lot about Henry VIII because the book I'm working on now will be out in October. It's called Godspeed, Godspeed, the Voices of the Reformation, and it mainly features William Tyndale and Martin Luther. But there's a few things in there about Henry VIII, and that whole time period fascinated me. But the divine right issue. You could have a king who's, kind of an inbred cretin,
Right.
It doesn't matter if he's got the blood. Henry VI was kind of that way, very sweet man, but just mentally challenged, very severely mentally challenged. And, so yeah, that you were kind of stuck with whatever you got, so.
Sort of brings to mind what went on in Rome, at one time with the Claudians, with their roles and but I don't.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Were there?
Divine right. It's old.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Were there a lot of? And I'm trying to set things up here to have people have an understanding of the times. Were there a lot of like in Rome? Were there a lot of killings of cousins and uncles? Was there a lot of paranoia that went on?
Well. Not so much really in the Scottish camp. I mean, the thing about the divine right is that they really believed it back then. So you really had to be real careful. You had to tread fearfully around nobility. Of course, that didn't keep them from kidnapping or sequestering Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was a threat to Elizabeth, and that's what got her in trouble. Mm-hmm. Mary, Queen of Scots had a rightful, she had a right to the throne, as much as many thought, even more of a right to the English throne than Elizabeth did. But Elizabeth was just more savvy than all of them put together. She had touches of her father, but Elizabeth also had touches of her mother too. Her mother was very witty, very shrewd. She knew how to get her way around men, and that was an age, man, where women just, misogyny was just kind of the rule. Very, very, very different than it is now. But Elizabeth, she said that she had the heart, and she knew she was a frail woman, but she had the heart and stomach of a king, and she actually did. John Knox, the famous Scottish preacher, and kind of ran Scotland there for a while. John Knox was afraid of Elizabeth, and. It's a fascinating time.
And he was a very powerful man. Didn't Knox? Was it Knox that took the oath of office for James when he was 13 months old, or was it Buchanan?
It could have been both of them. I don't. I know Buchanan was a part of it. I don't know if Knox. I know Knox dealt more with Mary than he did with her son James.
Mm-hmm. He was a teacher. He was a teacher for her, and he didn't care for James very much.
No, and he wrote a book that really got him in trouble, particularly with Elizabeth. It was called the Monstrous Regiment of Women. Basically, regiment meaning ruling. Ruler, headship. And he wrote that the very year that in 1558, the very year that Elizabeth became queen. And even as a young queen, she was only 25 when she became queen. She had a serious she had the right people about her. It's a great thing about leadership. She was smart. She had good people around her, but she that book kind of incensed her. Knox's book on the monstrous regiment of women.
And I think it would even anger women today, wouldn't you think? I mean,
oh goodness, absolutely. A lot of
could you see Bettina? Could you see your beautiful wife reading that book and not getting a little outraged?
Oh, I know. I can't think of any women that wouldn't get outraged. This book.
Yeah, let me just remind everybody, we're talking to David Teems. He's wrote this beautiful book, Majesty, the King Behind the King James Bible. And you've got to get out and get this book, ladies and gentlemen. I'm telling you that right now. It is a fabulous book, and it really gives you a look into the inside world of where, well, to be perfectly honest with you, as we will get to a little bit later on, King James lived at the time that colonies were starting to be settled in the United States, which we're going to get to a little bit later on. What fascinated you about King James? Because when you went to look and start doing your research on this, you were looking for one type of person, and instead you found, excuse me, somebody completely else.
Yeah, I was actually looking for the buffoon. I think I had read report. Propaganda is propaganda in any age. you're gonna have one side saying one thing, one side saying other. But James was such a delicious target. Here's a guy who waddled when he walks. He used to be accused of leaning on his favorites, and that's a subtle dig for, it's been said throughout history, depends on whose history you read, that James was homosexual. I don't buy that. I don't think, particularly in the way we think of homosexuality today. James had a very, very interesting childhood, and I think this is what broke my heart the most. He had no love around him. The closest thing he had to a mother was the Duchess of Mar, and she was so afraid of him, she would call him the Lord. Every time she addressed him, she addressed him as the Lord's anointed, and she was a little afraid of him. So imagine a child growing up with that. Buchanan kind of acted as a father figure, but he was kind of a bully. So the kid didn't have love. And so when he was 13 years old, his cousin Esme Stewart comes over from France, and Esme is probably in his early 40s. There's a good 20-something year difference. Maybe not quite 40. There's like a 24-year difference between their ages. So if James is 13, that would make him, 37? And Esme Stewart gives James love for the first time. Warmth and just this kind of affection, the kind of affection that seems more authentic. It wasn't just, didn't have an agenda behind it and stuff. And James literally fell head over heels for his cousin in a kind of romantic way, but you have to weigh in the fact that it's just one. It's not like we can think of it today. It was a matter of this young boy was starving for warmth, and it was at 13. You're still that's a developmentally that there's a transition going on right there, and so James had a very close relationship with him, and so Esme Stewart soon James made him a duke, and he rose up in power, and so the other factions eventually worked Esme Stewart out, and they basically stole him away from James, and it broke James's heart. So here's what happens, and this is what fascinates me. So when James is king now, in England particularly, he starts having young favorites, but they're all about the same age differences between him and Esme Stewart. They're all about 25 years younger than James. And so you see what I'm saying? There's kind of almost kind of a switch of the pattern going on there. And I don't really believe there's nothing documented, any type of behavior that we might call homosexual behavior, other than just a closeness and an extreme, kind of an exaggerated favor. Of one of his favorites, he said, Jesus had his John and I have my George, talking about George Villiers, which if it was a lover kind of a situation, you wouldn't just come out and say that in front of Parliament, a statement like that. He certainly wasn't saying that Jesus Christ had a relationship with John, the Apostle John. All of that, the point I was making, actually, I think I probably got on a rabbit trail, but James is such a delicious character to poke fun at. And that's what I went after at first. I thought, well, man, this guy, I've not done a biography before. I felt like I was more of a storyteller, but that's what Nelson wanted. They wanted a story for the general reader. And so I had been reading for years about James, and they allowed me to take some risks. And so the more I dug into James, the more I found out how brilliant this man was, and his heart was broken as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, he was neurotic, but like you said, the United States was a Jacobean enterprise. And there's in 1607 of Jamestown. So the United States, as we know it, was started during his reign in the King James Bible. There's so much that we owe to that man. There wouldn't be a King James Bible without King James. And that might sound kind of obvious to some, conspicuous or obvious to some of you out there, but a lot of times calling it the name of a monarch is kind of a nod to the ruling monarch. The monarch normally has nothing to do with it other than it's his reign. But James actually had a hands-on thing with the making of the King James Bible.
We're talking to David Teems, who was the author of Majestie, the King Behind the King James Bible. David, do a lot of people not know that the King James Bible was named after James, King James, or do they think maybe the Bible was named after, I know this may sound silly, but maybe one of the disciples or something that they used the name James for and they referred to him as a king? That just came to my head. Do people realize that it was actually named after a monarch, a king, or do they just think it was a biblical character that they named the Bible after in translation?
That's a good question. I've never heard that question before, but I kind of think that most people are pretty aware. I mean, we've distanced ourselves. We have distanced ourselves from these wonderful Bible translations. I wasn't, I read the NIV for years, and I still, when I do any kind of, study, it's really more the NIV because I feel like the New International Version kind of retained that lyrical voice that I really feel was intentional. I think when Tyndale translated Paul, for instance, there was a very powerful linguistic empathy between Tyndale and the Apostle Paul, and I think Tyndale Englished Paul or gave us the translation of Paul like no other translator has. I mean, the reason for that is, I know I'm getting off of that book and onto the book on Tyndale, but the reason for that is William Tyndale was living the same life that Paul had lived. When they talk about, who shall separate us from the love of Christ, or tribulation, distress, persecution, famine, naked, peril, or sword, Tyndale's living that. For 12 years that he translated the Bible, he's got a price on his head, target on his back. And so he was living the same kind of life Paul was living and then translating the words of Paul. So it's in that crawl space between the Greek and the Hebrew, the Greek and the English, that there's this empathy going on, and that's what, 1500 years between them. And it's just, those are the things that fascinate me about our English Bible. What we know about the King James Bible, really 90% or so of the King James New Testament is the translation of William Tyndale. So once you start studying the King James Bible, you are almost immediately introduced to William Tyndale, and William Tyndale is really the ghost in the whole mix. You got the 50 some odd, King James translators. You got the King. You got Richard Bancroft. You got Lancelot Andrews. You got a whole community. You have a village to make a Bible there. With Tyndale, he was by himself. He was alone. He had to make a science of hiding, and so it's when I bring the two ends of the 16th century together, Tyndale in the 1520s, and then King James in the early 1600s. When I put those two together, that's when I start getting animated and getting excited, because it's just, people don't know whether that or not they know it's King James or the brother of Jesus, whatever. What they really should know is the incredibly rich heritage we have as English-speaking people, much less as believers. For a believer, our English Bible was given to us by a holy man. William Tyndale was a holy man. I mean, he really was. He said that the gospel is too much for a half a man to preach. Mm-hmm. What he meant by that is that it's an all or nothing proposition. And so, again, when I talk about the King James Bible, I cannot help but talk about Tyndale, because really the credit, that luscious vitality of the King James or the King James Bible in the late Elizabethan age, that powerful vitality begins in Tyndale.
And also, as we discussed in a previous show, between Tyndale and Shakespeare, they did more for the English language than anybody.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But think about this. Going back to Tyndale now, and this reflects on the King James Bible too. But back in the day of Tyndale, it's 1522. He's about to go overseas. He's asked for permission to do an English Bible, and he's been, politely with the Catholic powers that be, they've said no, thank you. And then once he left, Cuthbert Tunstall, who was the Bishop of London at the time, he says, do not print anything of this young man. Keep an eye on this young man. Do not let him, in other words, this guy's trouble. So Tyndale left to go to do an English Bible. But at that time, there wasn't a vernacular scripture. There was no Bible for the common believer. They had the Roman Catholic Church was all Latin. Everything was in Latin. The service was in Latin. The Bible they read from, Jerome's Latin Vulgate, it was all Latin. And, most of the people did not know Latin, and very, very few of the priests did. They could intone it. As long as they intoned the Mass correctly, it was okay by, a church doctrine, an ex opere operato, which basically says if the presence of Christ is there in the Eucharist, then all you have to do is really just say you don't even have to understand what the Latin is as long as you're saying it right. And so the people went to church thinking, there's magic going on. The word hocus pocus comes out of that time. Hoc est corpus meum. This is my body. All they saw was all this wonderful stuff, this magic going on. So let me jump to Tyndale. Tyndale does an English Bible. All of a sudden, it's having to be smuggled in. It's an outlaw Bible, which made it that much more attractive. And so they would read it, and all of a sudden, they have it in their own language. They had never seen before, God is love. They didn't have that. And so they started really feeding on it, but they were also feeding on Tyndale's English. And so you skip a generation, then you're into the generation of Shakespeare. And by that time, the language had just really evolved. But Tyndale, boy, Tyndale was kind of like the Wittenberg door was to the Reformation. Tyndale's English Bible was kind of the Reformation of the English language. Before that, it was kind of yokel, kind of a language. Thomas More only used English when he cussed. Everything was Latin. The great Erasmus didn't even bother to learn English. But Tyndale single-handedly just shook it all down. And so the English, the King James Bible celebrates, it's really, to me, it's a celebration of William Tyndale as much as it is anything else.
Where did, and we're going to get into the Catholic Church here in a little bit, but I want to go back to James as a little boy. But where did faith, with everything going on, he was orphaned, he was kidnapped, he was bullied, he was abandoned, he was living in basically a one room with black drapes and black curtains all around him, and he became enamored with witchcraft, which wasn't uncommon for its day. But where did faith even enter into this young man's life? I mean, you've got to figure, if you look at if anybody else, you or I went through this, our lack of faith would be something that you would say, well, I understand why you don't trust in God. Where did his faith come from, and how did he manage to maintain that his whole life? Or was that also part of the environment in which he lived? And where did the influence come from for the Bible? Yeah,
you're right. The culture was very different than it was back then. We talk about church and state. But the truth is, it was more like church as state.
Yes.
If the church wanted somebody burned, for instance, there was a law that basically the church says we cannot shed blood. But it's kind of another one of those pretensions that they lived by, because the church and state were so symbiotic. They were so a part of one another that they would just have the magistrates, kind of like Pilate, with the Jews back then. The Jews had to use Pilate to carry out the sentence. It's kind of the same way that the Catholic Church called on the local authorities, or the temporality, as they called it, to carry out the execution. But the church basically ran Western culture. She was, their favorite metaphor is the Virgin and the Holy Mother, which represented the church itself. And so you really couldn't get away from your mother. She was, and you were attached to her with the same affections you were for a mother. And you could not get out of your mother's shadow, your mother. And so continuing that metaphor, if she was the mother and the Pope was the Holy Father, everybody else were the children, and the church taught the children what to believe, how to spend their tithe, how to do everything, how to have sex, how not to have sex, the celibacy of the priesthood and stuff. So church was it filtered into every franchise of life. And so when James was a little boy, of course, he had Buchanan as his teacher. You hear my dog in the background.
Yes.
Benita's not here. This dog is really attached to Benita, so he's just complaining.
Well, I can understand that. I mean, I've seen your wife. I've talked to your wife.
I've been barking too.
I'd be barking my butt off. Yeah.
There you go. James kind of grew up, but he was a Protestant. He grew up in a Protestant faith. There was a lot of this, the Roman Catholics still had a hold of England, but not so much Scotland. There was a real, by that time with the rise of the Presbyterian Church, the Scottish Kirk, it was a Protestant thing. So James grew up Protestant. That's another reason they didn't want his mother getting near him, because she was very, very Roman Catholic with a capital V. And, like Mary First of England wanted to make England Catholic once again. I think they were afraid of that with Mary Queen of Scots too. So Mary Queen of Scots didn't have a chance, but that's the world James grew up in. And now he also was taught to memorize large swaths of scripture, and he could do it in different languages. Not only could he read it, he would memorize large bolts of it. And I'm talking about as 6, 7, 8 years old. And so, he was learning Latin. He had normal activities. He had a few friends that he played with too. But he did it as royalty.
You also say in your book, we're talking to David Teems. I want to call you Tims, but it's Teems, the writer and author of Majestie, the King Behind the King James Version. And as I said, if you really want to understand Christendom back in those days, you need to get this book. You need to get the Tyndale book. You need to get the book that David will be coming on in October or November with me to talk about as well. I'm collecting his books because I love this man's writing, and I can't
Thank
stop
you, Gary.
it.
I appreciate that.
No, I do. I love it. Besides, I get to talk to Benita too.
There you go.
There you go. Here's the funny thing. Now, you talk about in the book that he had sort of a predilection towards witchcraft. He liked witchcraft. Wouldn't that not be the opposite of what the church would be teaching?
Well, actually, his fascination with witchcraft, he was fascinated with it, but in a dark kind of way, which I guess you would with witchcraft. Now that I think about it,
yeah.
But he preached against it. He was like Shakespeare, for instance. When James came to town, Shakespeare, boy, he played right to the king, man. And one of the ways he did that, and it almost got him in trouble, was to play Macbeth. Shakespeare was very aware of the king's short attention span. James probably had some form of ADHD. Here's a guy who literally could do 5 things at once. He could be writing, he could be reading, he could be carrying on conversation, and doing a couple of other things too at the same time. He's that fragmented and that much of that brilliant of a guy. But Shakespeare, of course, with Macbeth, it opens up with 3 witches, double toil and trouble, fire, burn, and
yes.
cauldron bubble.
I like that chapter too. I like that chapter. I really do.
Well, I got to really plunge into a chapter like that because James was rattled. Macbeth rattled James. It really did, because you got witches. You have a reference where at one point, one of the witches, Macbeth calls up. He wants to see his future because this other Banquo fella, some of his heirs, it's been prophesied by these witches that they're going to be king. And Banquo was actually in the line of James I of England, or James VI of Scotland. So Shakespeare threw enough of James in there just to just to really enchant him and charm the guy. And he was so easily charmed because he had this real, like before he married his queen, Anne, she was supposed to come to England to Scotland to marry him. Her ships got held up in Denmark by storms. And supposedly some witches held up that storm. So James writes her some love letters. He comes with a couple of hundred guys on a ship, on this quest to get his bride. But that was one of the issues there. And he actually, I forgot her name, but there was a witch that he had actually burned, that she confessed to doing things like that. Of course, they really tortured confessions out of people back in those days.
Oh, and if I can go back just a minute to the book on Tyndale, for the folks who weren't listening when we talked about the book on Tyndale, there was an influence with Tyndale. His name was Wycliffe, and Wycliffe had been dead for how many years before they were so angry about the English version of the Bible being printed that they dug this dead guy up after so many years, and whatever was left of him, they burned him at the stake. So, folks, burning at the stake was, was very common in those days. It's the most gruesome thing you could ever possibly witness next to a hanging.
That's true. William Tyndale was really the only. William Tyndale was the only Bible translator, the only one you can really say died for the sake of an English Bible. What happened it's a great story. I'm glad you brought it up with John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe lived in the mid 1300s. Of course, you got Tyndale in the early 1500s, but Wycliffe was kind of like the Luther before there was Luther. He's even known as the morning star of the Reformation. Because he started teaching about the decadence of the church and the wealth of the church and things like that. And then he did a vernacular Bible, an English Bible. This is Middle English. He was a contemporary with Chaucer. They were under the same patronage of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. And so Wycliffe did this Bible. So had he not died of a stroke, the Bible came out in 1382. Had he not died of a stroke, 2 years later, he would have been burned at the stake, but he died. So he's buried. And then Jan Hus comes up. A generation later, Jan Hus, a Bohemian, comes up. He starts reading Wycliffe, starts teaching Wycliffe, and starts following. He has a following. They call themselves Wycliffites. And so the church really gets ticked off. After 30 years now, they claim John Wycliffe. They finally claim him a heretic. But they take their time. 14 more years go by, and they have this ceremony with their lovely Latin, and they parade around the town of Lutterworth. They dig up his bones. He's not complaining. Complaining. They dig up his bones. They tie them to a stake, and then they burn them, and then throw them in the river.
And there's probably
really ridiculous.
Yeah, it's probably very little left of him. The reason that I also asked about James's being influenced by the Bible or by the church is that the Roman Catholic clerics tried to kill him on more than one occasion because he was a Protestant.
Oh, you're talking about James now?
Yeah.
He had. It was a very. It was a very interesting age. I've been feeding on the Reformation, and I kind of throw all of it together from the Reformation because it's kind of the same thing. I mean, the Reformation, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment later on, they all kind of come out of the same balloon, so to speak. But yeah, James. He had a lot of people after him.
Yes.
But by the time he came the English king, things were set. Elizabeth had been very smart. James inherited. He didn't inherit a lot of wealth, but he inherited Gloriana. He inherited what Elizabeth had left behind. Now she had lost a lot of her teeth and a lot of her sanity by her last days.
Let's explain to everybody that Elizabeth was his mother's cousin, and when she died, that's how he became the King of England.
Exactly. And one of the things that's interesting there, when it came time for Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587, they had a trial. She was tried for treason, and when they had convicted her and were going to sentence her to death, James, now he hadn't seen his mom since he was 13 months old. James basically had to keep his mouth shut. He basically had to just kind of turn his head and let it happen. So there was kind of this unspoken motherhood sonship between him and Elizabeth over the years. She would send him a couple of £1,000 here, 2,000 or 3,000 pounds there over the years. And so they had this close relationship. So when Elizabeth took James's mother's life, James literally, because of the throne ahead of him, because of the possibility of his inheriting the English throne, he basically had to turn his head, and he did. And we can look at him and we can probably condemn him for that. And yet he was not allowed to see his mother. And of course they're going to feed him false narratives. What do they call it? Fake news. They're going to
fake news. Yeah. Fake news.
Fake news. Yeah, that's not old at all, man. That's an old shtick. Aren't you sick of shtick? Just shtick?
Yeah. A lot of people,
pure shtick, man.
Fake news. You know what they used? David, you know what they used to call fake news when I was a kid?
The evening news?
No.
What do they call it? I don't remember. What do they call it?
A lie.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lie. Fake news is a lie. You're lying. You're lying through your teeth. You got a Pinocchio growing on the front of your nose, and fake news is a lie. And I'm sick of it. I'm so tired of it. Absolutely. It's insane. It's insane.
Oh, absolutely. Have you ever noticed too? And I think we can kind of work this back to our conversation. When I've talked to my brother about, like, this is the last election, for instance, and I'm not even gonna say anything to even let your audience know which way I voted, because for me as a believer, we really can't afford lean one way or the other. I've kind of embraced, and I hope people will hear me out before throwing anything. I've embraced more of a political indifference. I believe that, because I see that in Tyndale too. Tyndale was an innocent when it came to politics. But I was talking to my brother. Mm-hmm. He was very hard one way, and I was just not that. It wasn't like I was extreme the other way. I just wasn't his way, and our conversation got into a lot of heat, and I realized how much political arguments are like religious arguments. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is, with a religious argument, it's based on faith. It's not hard fact. It's things that you believe. I believe this really strongly, but I can't, I didn't see Jesus walking on the water, but I believe he did, and so there's belief involved. So you get over here in the politics, and that same kind of construct enters into a conversation where it comes off like a religious argument, because it's no longer about fact. We're not dealing with facts. We're dealing with belief. Oh, I believe this is the way it is. Well, I believe this over here. And so when you stand back and kind of take on a political indifference, which I think as Christians, and I didn't mean to get into this because I'm really kind of shaping my thoughts this way, but I think we all should be shaping our thoughts. I feel for pure Christianity, I feel like it's supposed to be straight up. In other words, straight up.
I think people,
it doesn't lean left or right, because the politics implies division, and the believer cannot afford division in their heart. Does that mean I can't go out and vote? Absolutely not. You can go out and vote. Martin Luther would say, vote your conscience, but your spirit, that's irreproachable. That's unnegotiable. It has
sometimes,
to remain straight
David,
up.
Sometimes people's faith are so strong, whether it be talking about religion or talking about politics or sports, that if they find a difference in their belief, they take it very seriously. There are people who believe in this president. He could be proven to be a Russian spy himself. And people will still say, oh, well, or he could turn out to be, that's his way, or whatever. Or they could find out that he's a great guy, and the people who don't like him will find fault with him. But let's get back here a little bit on track. We're talking to David Teems, the author of Majestie, the King Behind the King James Bible. Here's a question that I asked you off the air the other day. If the Catholic Church in Rome and throughout the world had been a little more open, a little less controlling, he had translated the Bible themselves and opened it up to the common person to understand things. Now, I understand that the Catholic Church had controlled Europe and other areas for very, very, very long, almost from the beginning, once the church started to expand out of Rome. If Rome had been a little more understanding of the common person and related better to them, there wouldn't have been a Reformation. There wouldn't have been Martin Luther. There wouldn't have been a need for Knox. There wouldn't have been a need for Tyndale.
You're right.
Or anybody else. So these would have been just normal people that have gone about their lives, and we never would have heard about them. So these are things that happen in history for, I believe, for a specific reason. But that's the reason for the Reformation. For people who are not aware of it, Martin Luther was just so appalled that once he really read the Bible, he went, "Wait a minute." God is there for everybody. It's not just there for you if you can read in Latin.
Right.
It's for everybody. So it's really the church that caused their own demise.
Oh, they did. Well, it started. You had the Medici's, the money family. They had, some of them were popes. You had the Borgia Pope. When Tyndale was born, he was born under Alexander VI, a Borgia Pope. Rodrigo Borgia.
Now, there's a real friendly family for you.
Yeah, and you can buy your cardinalship, and it was just it had got ridiculous. It was really bad in Wycliffe's day, but by the time Luther came along, it was awful. And a lot of the clerics they had mistresses. They had all kind of affairs going on, and they were fined. If they knew you were, having sex or going off with a prostitute or whatever, or had a concubine or a live-in wife or whatever, common wife, you would be fined. And the church allowed that because the fines puts money in somebody's pocket, And so, and then Tetzel comes along, and they want to build St. Peter's Cathedral and or Basilica. And of course, they have to pay Michelangelo something, for the Sistine Chapel. There's a lot of money being spent, and so they send this Tetzel guy to send out indulgences, which is basically, I don't want to explain the whole thing, but basically, there's extra merit in heaven because of the saints and because of Christ, and so they bank off of that. And if you put money in the, they're basically their shtick was, a coin in the coffer will get your grandmother or your Aunt Mildred out of purgatory.
Yeah.
And people were being led to the fact that they didn't know any better. That's what the church said. That the church's mother knows best. And so
it was so silly.
It's so bizarre. It's hard. And so Luther's thing, the Wittenberg door was basically to have a debate. He wrote 95 things why this is wrong, but he was calling for a debate. And somebody took that and had it printed up, and it was printing press back then was kind of like the Twitter of today, and it was just went viral. Next thing you know, the Pope sends a bull out and says either Luther has to recant or excommunicate, and Luther took the bull and had it burned. To him, the phrase "papal bull" had a much broader meaning than the actual meaning. So,
before we go too far, I just want to say this.
Sure.
James was married to Queen Anne. They had 9 children, and he loved his children. He gave his children
they had a lot of miscarriage. They had 6 that lived and had a few miscarriages and stuff. Yeah.
His greatest years, you say in the book, were 1604 and 1611. But here's the questions, because we've got about 10 minutes left, and okay. I want to get to this is a 2 or 3 part question. Okay. What part did James play in the translation of the Bible?
Okay.
How did the King James version of the Bible happen? And why should we, as human beings on this planet, care about the importance of the Bible, of the King James Bible?
Good question. First, James's role. They had a conference when James became king. The Puritans were complaining. They had what they called a millenary petition, which is supposed to be 1,000 names. It's more like 800, but millenary sounded better, and they wanted a conference to talk about church issues, and the war with Spain was going on, and so that was part of it too. So they had all the called it the Hampton Court Conference. But it was at that conference on day number 2 that there were only 4 Puritans. People didn't like Puritan. To call somebody a Puritan back then was really a bad word. It was the P word. You don't call people that, And so they wouldn't even let the Puritans in the meeting on day 1. They finally let them come in on day 2. And John Reynolds, one of them, was already beaten down. He said, Your Majesty, we feel like a new Bible needs to be presented. And James kind of lit up. It's almost like it hit epiphany, because Majestie, the notion of Majesty had fallen into decline with the very latter years of Elizabeth's reign. Like I said, she was losing her mind a little bit, and because there wasn't an heir, they weren't sure who was going to be the next king. It wasn't like James wasn't like a sure thing. So that always unsettles the kingdom. Civil wars can break out and things like that. But James felt that a Bible that could reflect the language of that era, because he had Shakespeare on his payroll. Shakespeare was hot. At Oxford and Cambridge, they wouldn't have plays at all. They thought it was low life until Hamlet came along. Shakespeare changed the whole linguistic landscape. James was in this rich vitality in late Elizabethan, early Jacobean thing. So he felt like a new Bible could reflect the reign, reflect His Majesty. And he actually told them, he said, I want you to set forth the language. He used the word gorgeous. I want you to set it forth gorgeously. And all of these guys, the 50 some odd guys they chose, they had all been weaned on the Elizabethan sonnet. They had pretty much all seen Hamlet. They probably knew Shakespeare personally. And so there was just this, it still fascinates me. But James and Richard Bancroft and Lancelot Andrews, they put together the 50 some odd, my phone is on 10%, so if it dies, we should be able to finish this interview, though.
Yeah, we've got about 8 minutes left.
Okay, cool. They put together the 50 some odd guys, set them out in six companies. Each one took a different part of the Bible, and everybody in the companies would check everybody's work, and then the companies checked each other. It took a few years to do that, and they wanted sound. Sound was the issue. It was an audible culture. It was an oral, A-U-R-A-L, oral fascination that drove these men. And, what they did, they had different King James Bible is not really a translation. It's more of a compilation of the best English Bibles, Tyndale. There might have been a copy of Wycliffe, but then they had the Bishop's Bible. They had the Great Bible. They had Miles Coverdale. All of the existing English Bibles, and the Bishop's Bible was kind of like the template. They sought lines from each to enhance those lines, or give them, the language of the age. Like I said, they mainly used Tyndale. They cleaned up Tyndale, like for instance in Philippians 4. Whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure. That's line for line William Tyndale. They part on the next one where William Tyndale would say, whatsoever things pertain to love. Well, the King James translators translated that, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are a good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. So it's almost like you've got Tyndale, the sound of William Tyndale. Then you've got what literally is, not literally, but at least in form is Shakespeare. You have the William Tyndale, whatsoever things pertain to love. You got the Shakespeare sound, whatsoever things are lovely. Whatsoever the music continues there, where it kind of stumbles a little bit in Tyndale, but that's what they did. They took Tyndale's lovely Christmas story. Tyndale's lovely prologue of John 1. Lovely opening of the Bible. Tyndale did the Old Testament from Genesis to 2 Chronicles and the book of Jonah. And Tyndale even though he didn't do Psalms, he set the sonic template for Psalms. In the book of Exodus, there are some praises and some worship language there that you can read note for note in Coverdale's Psalms. And so, it's just, and so after so many years, and now the one Bible that wasn't a part of the King James translation, that they didn't have on the table, was the Geneva Bible. James hated the Geneva Bible, and it was the most popular Bible of that age. Shakespeare used the Geneva Bible. James didn't like it because most of the places where they would use the word king, they would use the Geneva Bible would use the word tyrant, and James hated that. So in 1616, a few years after the King James Bible was out, because King James Bible was not popular when it first came out. The Geneva Bible was still popular, but by 1616, James made a law and made the reading or the ownership of the Geneva Bible made it unlawful.
So why do we need today to pay to what is the importance of it today for all of us?
I think if we lose touch with our cultural memory, we lose something. We really do. We really need to know. I love language. Before anything, I'm a writer. I'm finishing up a book now. I actually turn it in tomorrow, but I've been doing 12, 14-hour days, sleepless. I look like the mad professor. I love language, but when you love language, it's particularly doing these books on Tyndale and in the King James Bible, it gave me an appreciation that I didn't really have. To get to my roots, to feed on the real genius of the language. All of the words exist, and you can plunge into those, and you feed on people like Shakespeare or the writers, the great writers of the 20th century, Thomas Wolfe or Marcel Proust or whoever your favorites might be. I was a big Pat Conroy fan. Ian McEwan. You feed on the genius of the language, and you begin to. It's just so healthy to know our roots. Even I love to listen. Matter of fact, in this book I'm just doing, it's called Godspeed. All the scriptures that I have in there are in the original spelling, from William Tyndale, Miles Coverdale, the Bishop's Bible. And there's something about the original spelling. I mean, like when Tyndale says, when he translates, ask and it shall be given, seek and you shall find, he uses the word axe, A-X-E, axe, and it shall be given unto you. And a lot of people did back then, because really the word axe, Tyndale would argue, the word axe is much easier on your speech apparatus than the word ask. Try it for yourself. Ask or ask.
Yeah. Here's the final question, because we only got a couple of minutes left.
Okay.
Well, and that's really it's a twofold thing. We're talking to David Teems, the author of Majestie, the King Behind the King James Bible. One, what do you want people to take away from this book, Majestie? And two, the King James Version has never been authorized.
You're right. You're right. And they call it the authorized version. That's what's so funny. What I would love for people to take away is the same thing I did. When I walked away, I learned about the King James Bible, and that's great. I love language stuff. But for me, it was James himself. It is possible to spend time with these people, and I believe that deep in the human spirit, and particularly people who would embrace the gospel, because I see this happening in Tyndale and some other writers. There was something about the Reformation that brought out the poetry in these people, because they were so hard pressed. We have the beauty of our language because Tyndale had a target on his back. Every day he had to reckon with, am I going to die today? And so he's translating the English Bible. He's perfecting. He had a different version came out. A revised version came out in 1534 with 5,000 different edits in it. He was that. To watch his life is to watch how obsession works. But I would like for people to take away something of James himself. He was a beautiful. I felt he was a beautiful boy, but he had no one to love him. and it showed up in his later life. You know, he loved his kids, he loved his wife. They had a very healthy sex life, but he was attracted to young men too. I think James has to be judged more as an adolescent when it comes to love and stuff. But I fell in love with the guy. I could cry for him. I can't tell you how many times I've cried doing this book on the Reformation. People like Anne Askew, this young 25-year-old girl who was burned at the stake, but she was brutalized, tortured on the rack. They racked her so hard because she didn't believe in transubstantiation. They racked her so hard that they pulled her bones out of her joints. And 25 years old, and they had to take her to the scaffold to be burned in a chair because she couldn't move.
That will be for the next time that we talk with the next book.
I love this, man.
I know. You can. If I let you go, you go for an hour. We've been talking to David Teems, the author of Majestie, the king behind the King James Version. He also wrote a book about William Tyndale. If you want to find out more about this man, just go to his website, David Teems, TEEMS.com. He will tell you everything about himself. He is one of the most gracious gentlemen. His wife, what a wonderful, wonderful young woman you are married to, young man. And the doggy added a little spice to the show. So
yeah, there you go. He's barking at me.
But Dave, thank you so much for joining us here on the Express.
Well, thank you.
Well, you're going to be back with us this fall. I'm going to talk to Benita in the next couple of weeks to a month.
Excellent.
And we'll set up a time to have you back on when that book is published. Because I'm collecting your books now, and I love that. So thank you again, sir. And again, you go to davidteems.com. His website is there. Everything in the world you need to find out about this young man. And he is a brilliant writer. And I thank you again, sir.
Thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it.
All right. Well, that just about ends this edition of The Express. Again, you can find out your information about me at Gary Allen. You can also go to youtube.com, Gary Allen, The Express. This program will repeat itself on Thursday night at 7 p.m. on diversitybroadcastnetwork.com, Progressive Voices. It'll be up on YouTube. You can go to my website, GaryAllenTalkShow.com. Find out more information. Part of the website is still being built, so I appreciate it. And I thank all of you for taking the time to join us here on The Express, this edition of Gary Allen, saying until next week, take care of yourselves and each other.
You've been listening to The Express with Gary Allen. Join us here every Tuesday night at 10 for more captivating talk with Gary Allen. See you next time on The Express.